April 21st, 2009 of the City of Santa Barbara Ordinance Committee to order. Tree preservation policy recommendations are our subject for today. Ms. Zachary.
Councilmember Williams, council members, today's presentation follows a December 8th presentation to the City Council where staff presented policy recommendations, and at that time council forwarded them to the Ordinance Committee. I will be doing the bulk of the presentation. Assistant City Attorney Scott Vincent will be going over the ordinance amendments at the end of the presentation. We also have Tim Downey, the city's arborist, and Renee Brook from Zoning and Enforcement. And Carol Bornstein from the Street Tree Advisory Committee is here as well. Just to begin the presentation, we'd like to review very quickly how we got here and what we were charged with. As you remember, in late 2007, 2008, we had some very high-profile violations of both tree preservation ordinances and landscape maintenance. And at that time, Council directed staff to do an in-depth review of our city policies, our enforcement procedures, and come back with some recommendations. An interdepartmental staff team was formed to do that work. That work was carried out over a series of about 10 months and involved a number of public meetings, both public workshops and meetings with various boards and commissions, including the ABR, the HLC, Park and Recreation Commission, Street Tree Advisory Committee, and Single Family Design Board. Staff presented recommendations to Council on December 9th, and at that time, Council recommended that they be forwarded to the Ordinance Committee, but also recommended that staff do some additional work looking specifically at the American National Standards Institute pruning guidelines as well as best management practices. I'd like to just point out very briefly that today's work effort is really focused on trees. Council did forward the landscape plan maintenance recommendations to the Ordinance Committee as well, and those will be following in the next couple of months. So today's presentation and recommendations are focused on the tree preservation policies. So in December, and in response to Council direction, the staff proposal was to clarify some of our regulations that weren't necessarily clear and consistent. There was a significant interest in how do we discourage both unauthorized tree removals and also excessive and damaging pruning as being sort of the very egregious violations that become quite profile. And as I said earlier, we presented those to Council. Those were forwarded to the Ordinance Committee, which you have in your packet today. And then we also spent the last couple of months doing some additional work. And that work included reviewing the ANSI A300 pruning standards and best management practices, and specifically seeking the recommendations of the Street Tree Advisory Committee and the Park and Recreation Commission as the two committees that are charged with protecting the city's publicly regulated urban forests. So both our street trees, our publicly owned trees, and then private trees that are regulated by the city's municipal code. So the focus of today's discussion is those pruning standards and best management practices. We'd like to review with you the Chapter 1520 and 1524 amendments, and then also review again the enhanced penalties that were proposed at Council in December and the Education and Information Program. The A300 pruning standard is written as a guide, and it's a guide to develop specifications for pruning for both public sector and private sector. It establishes job objectives and specific recommendations to achieve those objectives. Your Council packet has that information, which the most recent 2008 standard. The American National Standards Institute publishes standards for a range of industries. This happens to be the one that they do related to trees. And these standards are used both by our department, because we write contract specifications. We have contract tree work done on an annual basis for the city. And they're also used as a guideline for our own practices. The BMPs themselves also provide techniques. So they really are a tool that's used by urban forestry industry. When we met with the Street Tree Advisory Committee, and their meeting was in March 5th. The ANSI A300 standards and BMPs were provided to them. Your packet also includes the staff report that we provided to them. And the Street Tree Advisory Committee discussion focused in on sort of critical elements that were raised during public comments to council and through our public meetings related to this overall size reduction of a tree. So under Chapter 1524, which is private tree regulations, a setback tree does not require a permit if it's being pruned. It requires a permit if it's being removed. It requires a permit if there's an interest to either remove more than 1/3 of it or significantly alter it. And the key question and concern around that is what constitutes a significant alteration. And under the ANSI standard, there's a recommendation for 1/4 foliage in any 1 year or growing cycle. So that's where a lot of the discussion focused at the Street Tree Advisory Committee. They also discussed the challenge of determining violations. The question was, should ANSI standards be used as an enforcement tool? And with a specific focus on the reduction of foliage, how would it be determined whether there was an actual violation? Or should the ANSI standard actually be a guideline that the city either requires through its own permitting of trees or encourages for the private pruning of private trees? And really keeping in mind that the goal is really what's the benefit to the urban forest within a realm of practicality. So during the Street Tree Advisory Committee discussion, those were the key issues that they addressed and their key concerns. We presented to the committee at that time the recommendations that had been presented to council, and they subsequently made recommendations to further change the amendments that we had proposed. Our proposal was to remain with the 1/3 allowed reduction without a permit, and the Street Tree Advisory Committee, and this was a unanimous vote on their part, recommended that we define substantial alteration as the reduction of the height or spread of the tree crown to 1/4 rather than 1/3. And that also that we include in the amendments the requirement that work that is done by permit on city trees. So if one had a street tree in front of one's house and wanted to prune it, you need a permit to do that, that we would require that that tree be pruned in accordance with ANSI standards. As it stands right now, when someone receives a permit to prune a city tree, they have to have a certified arborist. There are other mechanisms in place where we ensure that trees are pruned correctly. But the Street Tree Advisory Committee felt this was an added benefit to include that in municipal code. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, the discussion of referencing the pruning standards in Chapter 1524, which really focuses on private trees that are regulated, setback trees, parking lot trees, and the recommendation that we encourage the public to follow these standards when they're pruning their trees. Again, these trees do not require a permit now for pruning. They require a permit for removal or a permit if they're to be significantly altered. Very briefly, I'll go over generally the amendments. As I said earlier, Assistant City Attorney Scott Vincent will go over them in more specificity, and they are attached to your report. One of the items that we discussed with the Street Tree Advisory Committee is formalizing the role of the committee. The committee is appointed by the Park and Recreation Commission, was established by the Park and Recreation Commission, and clearly plays a significant role when it comes to tree preservation. So the proposed amendments include formalizing their role as a committee of the city. As I mentioned earlier, compliance with ANSI standards for permitted work on city trees, and there are other minor revisions. Chapter 1524 has a number of additional revisions that really speak to both the desires of council and then also public input on how we do more to further discourage significantly pruning of trees either without a permit or in contrary to city code, there are revised definitions regarding removal, significantly altered tree crown, and front setback trees. As I mentioned earlier, proposal to revise that standard in response to the Street Tree Advisory Committee and Park and Recreation Commission recommendations from 1/3 to 1/4, and then also a proposal that we establish a 12-month period, whereas right now the ordinance doesn't establish a time frame. And then, as mentioned to Council in December, a new exception for fire department defensible space. So none of that has changed since our recommendations were made to you in December. Very briefly, I'd like to go over the penalties, since those are part of the recommendations. Right now, we have a penalty of $100, which is a citation for a violation of the municipal code. Staff recommendation is that we establish a fine structure that's specific to tree violations, that the fine is applied to property owners and or the person who performed the work if it's warranted, case-by-case basis. As we do now, require follow-up action. And then as the next couple of slides, next slide will indicate, provide flexibility depending on the type of violation. This fine schedule is a revised one. Staff developed one and presented it in a number of public meetings, and the feedback we got was resoundingly, it needs to be more significant if we really are going to deter the type of action that can happen in the city. Just briefly, currently we do enforce on tree violations. We do that in conjunction with the Community Development Department. As I mentioned, we have a $100 per tree citation, which can be interpreted as not quite a deterrent. And we do, if warranted, impose fines on both the owner and the person company, so there's no changes to those recommendations. And then also, our recommendations wouldn't change the fact that the city does have other mechanisms, both civil litigation and criminal prosecution, if through the administration citation process we don't get the issue resolved. The proposed penalties, enhanced penalties, are based on the size of the tree and the type of offense. So the proposal is, as an example, trees that are 4 to 12 inches in diameter, up to $500 for a pruning offense, up to $1,000 for removal. And it goes on higher depending on the size of the tree. And again, the proposal here is, A, provide flexibility, but also provide a significant enough deterrent for those really egregious violations, which bring more public attention and public concern. And we have a couple of examples to show you. This is an example of a city tree, a magnolia tree that was pruned without a permit, and the character was significantly altered. From the staff perspective, that would be on the higher end of a violation. And similarly, this is a setback tree that was pruned significantly without a permit, essentially topped, and that would be considered a significant violation. Lastly, to complete the presentation, as we presented to Council in December, clearly a key factor in being successful in increasing compliance with our tree preservation policies is education and information. And through the work that we did last year, it became fairly clear that we needed to support education for the landscape professionals and tree care companies. Basic understanding of the municipal code. Our proposal is also to include information about ANSI standards and best management practices in that training, so that it's fairly clear what the city requires and expects. Also, our website can be improved with additional information, the municipal code sections that relate to trees, the pruning and removal permits, and then permit processing for parking lot tree removal or pruning. And those are things that we would move forward with as a way to further enhance people's understanding of the tree preservation policies. And with that, our recommendation to the Ordinance Committee is that you both consider the amendments that Mr. Vincent will review and forward those to City Council for introduction and adoption.
Questions? Mr. House.
Thank you for the presentation. That's really brings a lot down to comprehensibility. It gets really complex, and thank you very much. Just about scope of our discussion. At Planning Commission level and Architectural Board of Review level, HLC level, there are required landscaping plans associated with development proposals. And sadly, in many cases, the landscaping that's been required is neglected and allowed to die off, or is actually summarily removed at some point in the future without any notice or anything, and the good intentions are all gone for nothing. So is this at all within the scope, or is that something that we'll be discussing separately in a future discussion?
Councilmember House, when we were at Council in December, we did recommend that an ordinance be developed to address landscape maintenance plans, maintenance of landscape plans. That work is still under development and would be brought to the Ordinance Committee at a later date.
Okay, thank you. With regards, and today we're focusing on trees, the areas where the trees, where the requirements that we're talking about here, where permits are required, all of this is within the setback or within the public right-of-way. Actually, help me understand exactly where we are discussing. Part of it is recommendations on private property, but that is in the form of recommendations. Where is it that we're talking about where these are requirements?
Councilmember House, Chapter 1520 is the street tree ordinance, so it's specific to public trees, whether they're street trees, trees located in public parks, public facility trees, any public tree on public land, so to speak. And then Chapter 1524 relates more to private trees, so trees that are located in a front setback, which can vary depending on whether it's single family, multifamily, and or trees that are covered under a development scenario like a parking lot.
Okay, good.
If that helps.
Yes, very good. And then the other piece of that, because it has come up from the public, but also it's a big part of this, is historic or landmark type trees or trees associated with historic structures or properties. Where does that fit into this? That's not specifically 1520 because it may not be public land. It could be private land that has historic designation. So how does that fit into this?
Councilmember House, it fits under both, whether it's a public historic tree or a private historic tree. It's covered, a historic or specimen tree that's designated by City Council is covered under
whether or not it's in the front yard setback of a private property. Okay, good. Thank you.
Other questions? I have one. So to follow up on Mr. House's questions, so for instance, had this been in effect when the unauthorized cutting of trees on a private property, say off Anapumu, for instance, if that had been brought, there would not have been a violation for every single one of those, but there would have been ones that were deemed historic by the city on that private property. Am I getting that right? Or
Mr. Chair?
No?
I'm happy to answer that question.
And then maybe you can just go into your part of the presentation because I know you want to flesh out these details.
The 601 East Anapumu has factually was difficult, and I'm not entirely sure if any or all of the trees. I know that not all of the trees were within a front setback. So the proposals regarding 1524, Chapter 1524 today, are not extending the scope of the regulation as far as the area of a lot that is regulated. It remains as the front setback, parking lot trees that are required by the zoning ordinance to be placed as part of a parking lot, and then specimen or historic trees. With respect to specimen and historic trees, there is a process where the City Council affirmatively designates a tree by resolution. So that is the only way a tree becomes a specimen or historic tree. Specimen or historic trees can exist anywhere on a lot. It could be that whether it's in the front setback, in the front yard, in the backyard, anywhere on a lot. And we do have a couple historic trees or landmark trees that are actually on city property as well. Morton Bay fig tree is the brightest example of it. So the scope of the ordinance in that respect is not changing. With respect to 1524, the things that are changing are we're going from staff recommendation at this point is going from 1/3 of the size of the crown to 1/4 of the size of the crown, mimicking the 1/4 reduction standard from the ANSI standards. Key distinction from the staff recommendation for 1524 and the ANSI standards is this element of whether we're measuring the foliage of the tree or the size of the crown. Our recommendation is the size of the crown. This is because the way that the city regulates trees and the way that the city discovers violations is an after-the-fact exercise. It's not a prospective exercise. And it's from our advice from our city arborist is that it is too difficult to determine after the fact how much foliage has been removed. Whereas if you measure the size of the reduction of the crown, you can look to the branches that are cut and the branches that are remaining, and given the species of the tree, you can extrapolate out how much of the crown has been reduced, whether it's the height or spread. Prior to our exercise here, there were comments from, quite honestly, even the arborist, that our definition of the overall size of the tree wasn't clear, because different people have different perspectives as what is the overall size of the tree. Again, in this case, we look to the ANSI standards and their definitions of the tree crown as a new way of explaining and clarifying what we historically meant as the overall size of the tree. So with those explanations with respect to the application of the ordinance on 601 as an example of how the 1524 works, I would like to backtrack just for a second, cover the changes that we're proposing in Chapter 1520, which regard the street trees or public trees, and then I can answer any questions the committee has regarding Chapter 1524. On the
One question first.
Sure.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question. When you mentioned that specimen and historic trees have to be specified by resolution of council, can you give me an idea of how many trees have been given that special treatment?
I don't have the specific number. Maybe Mr. Downey does.
Councilmember Francisco, the current list that I have has 10 trees on it.
Okay. And how do trees get added to that list? I mean, I understand that there has to be a resolution of council, but is that something that anyone can initiate, and what's the process?
The recommendation comes either from the Park and Recreation Commission or the Historic Landmark Commission to the council for designation, depending on where that lies. And if someone wanted a tree to be designated, they would go to the appropriate review body and make that request.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Downey.
Not to be labored, but it's really important to me, the idea somehow that a historical site, that the landscaping is as important as perhaps even the structure that might be there, because it's part of the ambiance, part of the environment. What would we have to do to ensure that the landscaping or trees or whatever that is associated with a historic site would be protected or covered, if you will, within that umbrella of historicity?
Mr. Chair? I'm happy to answer that.
Thank you.
When a building is landmarked, again, there's a council resolution establishing the landmarking. And I've talked with Mr. Lamone in the Community Development Department, who administers the Historic Landmarks Commission, and we've discussed this topic both in the context of landscape plans, but also just in a more general sense regarding landmarking in general, that it probably is a good practice to begin being more specific about the scope of the landmarking. An example I'd give is there are historic designations at Santa Barbara High School. The main building is designated as a landmark. The ticket kiosk behind the stadium is designated as a landmark. I would suggest that there are trailers on the high school property that are probably not appropriate for landmark designation. And so there's a case where we've been very careful about which structures on the property are designated with landmark status and therefore subject to very close scrutiny. An example that may be presented to you today, there was recently a number of trees that were removed from a property where the home is designated as a landmark. But I don't believe the landscaping was designated as a landmark. Absolutely can be important to the setting of the property and the context of the landmark. But if we're not careful in our designation, then the staff who come along later, or even a property owner who comes along and buys the property, isn't put on notice as to the import of that landscaping. So I've recommended to Mr. Lamone that we become much more specific in our landmark designations in that respect, because I think I could also see examples where the home may be landmark worthy, but the landscaping may not be appropriate to the period of significance, and therefore you wouldn't want to landmark the landscaping in that context. So I think that there's room in the designations for landmarking.
This really
to be
is
more
helpful
specific.
to me, Mr. Vincent. Thank you. And I think that for the future, and maybe we should make a note of that out of today's conversation, that we would want to engage with the Historic Landmarks Commission or at some level the staff to add that kind of a question or prompt in that process to what specifically about the landscaping is an aspect of this historic designation. That could be an outcome that would be a positive one out of this dealing with the historic stuff. I'm sorry to take so much time, but thank you.
No problem. Turning your attention back to Chapter 1520, there are only a couple major revisions in 1520. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about the minor revisions, but I want to focus on just simply two major revisions. The first, as Ms. Zachary mentioned before, in this process, we're recommending a formalization of the Street Tree Advisory Committee process, particularly because of our recommended increase in the fines. We anticipate that parties who are found to have violations are going to be presenting much greater scrutiny to the process. And we found that the Street Tree Advisory Committee, while it is fulfilling an important role, that role just was very informal. In fact, there was no neither chapter, neither 1520 nor 1524, included the Street Tree Advisory Committee in its permitting processes. So that's the first process. On page 8, we're amending section 1520.110, and there's a lot of underlining there. All of that is incorporating the Street Tree Advisory Committee into the permitting process for private work on public trees. The second change, significant change to 1520, is found on page 12 of the ordinance attached to your report. These are the conditions that would be incorporated into the permit for an approved private maintenance of a public tree. Historically, the city has required that the work be done by a professional firm that presents the city with liability insurance covering its work. The new addition to these conditions of approval is that that firm now conduct its work in accordance with the ANSI standards. What that would require is them to present their objectives for the project, create specifications for the work, and follow that work through according to the specifications. Just one more comment on 1520, answering Committee Member House's question, or actually, I'm sorry, Committee Member Francisco's question. The designation of specimen in historic trees occurs pursuant to Section 1520-180, which is found on page 15 of the ordinance in your package. Turning now to Chapter 1524, which concerns the regulation of private trees. And Ms. Zachary has covered this in fairly significant detail. I just want to kind of pinpoint what sections were achieving the changes that she's already mentioned. On page 15 again, a new section 1524.001 proposes the recommendation and the encouragement that private property owners incorporate the ANSI standards in their tree maintenance.
Mr. House has
Just a
one
real quick question on that, just since we're just plodding right through these. So there's a shift in language between 1520-130, which has shall comply, where a person, firm, or corporation is doing work on public property, and then there's objective specifications in conducting the work according to that. 1524, here we're on private property, and the private entity or individual or whomever is doing the work. So here we've shifted to recommends and encourages. And would you describe why or what the distinction is there, and why we would not say shall and then have that standard established against which we could balance any misdeed or problem that might arise, or maybe even compliance, if that were the question?
The distinction between the two chapters is reflective of the way the city regulates tree preservation, and is reflective of the staffing level that the city is able to apply to these projects. 1524 requires Chapter 1520 requires private property owners to get a permit before any maintenance activity or removal of a street or public tree. That enables and allows for that permitting process, enables the introduction of the ANSI standards into that process. Conversely, the city's regulation of private trees is not a prospective activity. Most pruning activities can occur outside of and without a city permit. As Ms. Zachary mentioned before, a city permit or a city requirement or the prohibition only applies if a tree is significantly altered or removed without a permit. And so the city is not really involved with a lot of the private maintenance of trees. It has an enforcement mechanism that kicks in if a tree is significantly altered, and it has a permitting process that kicks in when a tree is proposed to be removed, a regulated tree. And so that's why you're seeing the difference between 1520 and 1524.
Okay, it's a clear explanation. If I understand it correctly, instead of on the private work on private land, instead of having a standard established that would possibly avoid or reduce the chances of there being poor pruning practices, it requires there to be a violation for the city to be drawn into violation. Well, what would it be violating? It would be a serious bad thing done to a tree, to put it in lay person's terms, would be the challenge that would bring the city into it. Is that my understanding?
Yes. Yeah. The lay definition of serious bad thing that happens to a tree.
Thank you.
Is incorporated into the ordinance as a significant alteration. And the significant alteration, as it's recommended by staff, is the reduction of the height and or spread of the tree crown by more than 1/4 within any 12-month period, or a trimming that results in a significant alteration to the natural character of the tree.
Almost the same as what the ANSI standards have, but a slight difference in
The key difference
there.
is
Yeah.
is the distinction between foliage and crown height or spread.
Okay, well, we can come back to this in comments, but it helped me understand the rationale. Thank you.
As Ms. Zachary mentioned in her presentation, we're changing some of the definitions. As I said before, that was in some cases responsive to comments from members of the public. In some cases, it was based on staff experience in attempts to enforce the ordinance. So where we're finding the changes, we've changed from cut down or otherwise destroy. I'm on page 16 of your ordinance. Cut down or otherwise destroy, those changes have now been brought into the new definitions of remove a tree or significantly alter a tree. That adds in a concept. The cut down or otherwise destroy didn't cover the removal of a tree. You could dig up a tree and move it to someplace else, and you haven't cut a tree. You've moved it. So now, I mean, and I think that historically, probably that nobody thought that was an issue, something we needed to deal with. But now, I think you're all familiar with. There are very expensive, valuable species of trees that there's a market for. And there are cases where that palm tree that's blocking your view, you're not going to cut it down. You're going to take it out and sell it to somebody else who wants to use it. So we've expanded it because the removal has the same injury to the public, to the urban forest, as the cutting down. That resource in that location is no longer there even once it's removed. So we thought it would be appropriate to include removals in addition to cutting down. At this point, I think unless you have other questions, Ms. Zachary really did cover the remaining part of 1524 in very good detail, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have concerns or are wanting to know about exactly how this plays out in the language of the ordinance. But for sake of brevity, I'll stop right here.
I have two more questions. One is to follow up on Mr. House's question on landscape plan enforcement. When are we going to be looking at that? I mean, give me a general ballpark figure.
Mr. Chair, I'm working on that right now.
Okay.
Just to give you a context, these ordinance revisions were
3 months.
No,
6 months?
I'm hoping to be to the ordinance committee sometime in May.
Great. And then the second question that I had is these enforcement actions are appealable from the Street Tree Advisory Committee to the Parks and Rec Commission, and then appealable to the council. And I had the question, both for my colleagues here and for the public and for staff, is that really, since we're redoing this, is that really the best way? And kind of what I view as the good thing about the Parks and Rec Commission being a final arbiter would be that it takes some of the politics out of the decisions. The bad part is that, obviously the council has more direct accountability to the voters than the Parks and Rec Commission. But I was just trying to think that through and wonder if it would not be better to have the Parks and Rec Commission be the final arbiter on all or some of these cases. And so I just throw that out for a thought, especially if we get a whole lot of these cases or more because of the fact that the fines are more. And I would assume that we would probably get more appeals because of the value of the fine. But if staff has a reaction to that, or if you want to think about it for a second, but I just wanted to think if there is any imperative on that issue.
Chair Williams, if I could just make sure I understand your question / comment, the Street Tree Advisory Committee and the Park and Recreation Commission, Street Tree Advisory Committee makes recommendations to the Park and Recreation Commission regarding permits, whether for removal or for pruning. Although actually I don't think we do it, and we do the pruning administratively. If the commission denied a removal, an applicant could appeal that to the city council. Through the administrative citation process, that's conducted at the administrative level, and an individual that does receive an administrative citation can appeal it, and the administrative citation ordinance outlines the guidelines for that, and can request a hearing, and that hearing does occur, and so on and so forth. And Mr. Vincent can speak more specifically to that. When the Street Tree Advisory Committee was created, looking back in the Park Commission at that time notes, the Park Commission was really looking for people with expertise that could help inform their decisions. And the Street Tree Advisory Committee both considers the request, then actually goes out and inspects the tree, and that information is forwarded to the commission at their next meeting, and commissioners go out and look at those trees as well. And sometimes there is a difference of opinion between the two, but they really rely on the Street Tree Advisory Committee to give them that expertise from a tree care urban forest perspective. And I think from the staff standpoint, the process does work well.
But then that administrative citation is appealable to council, or is it not?
No.
Okay. All right. Good. Then that I was just reading through the ordinance, and I was reading appealable to council, but it must be only for the getting the permit itself. Is that correct? Okay. Okay. One other question for Mr. House, but
I know we have the public to speak as well. I just want to ask for scoping. I see the private firms doing work on public property, and I see private work being done on private property. Where in here does it establish the standard for the city's work crews and the work that we do in the public or whatever we do as a city entity on the trees?
Chair Williams, Councilmember House, the city's Parks and Recreation Department does the maintenance of our public trees, and we use the ANSI standards as a guideline. In some cases, a tree may be pruned more or a tree may be pruned less, depending on what the tree needs and where it fits within our scope. We have 27,000 street trees and over 12,000 private trees, park and facility trees. So we take into consideration the larger objectives of the city organization when it comes to our pruning practices. If Mr. Downey has anything he'd like to add, I might ask him to do that too.
When we use the ANSI standards also within our contract specifications for our contractors, there's specific language in the contract that comes directly from the ANSI standards. Our staff has been trained in the ANSI standards, and it would be going quite a bit beyond what we do now to actually write written specifications for everything that our staff does, but we do follow the standards.
Okay, well, that's good. My question, I understand it's a practice, so you're just telling me is what the practices are. Where is the standard established for the city crews or for our city staff in doing this? Does it exist in ordinance? Does it exist as an administrative requirement? Against what standard do you hold? Let's see, how can I say it? Where does the actual requirement come from that would allow you to hold your crew? Is it just based on each manager's understanding of the ANSI standards, or is it something that's a departmental thing, or does it exist in ordinance somewhere?
Chair Williams, Councilmember House, it's the matter of practice that we have in maintaining our urban forests, just as we maintain any other facility that we have, whether it's a park or a restroom or a building or something like that. I think this city has operated an urban forestry program for many, many years, and one of our objectives is always to ensure that we stay on top of changing industry, and that also many of our staff are certified arborists, and we encourage that as well.
Which is when the city builds a building, we have to abide by the same building codes as anyone else, right? So I was thinking in terms of landscaping and maintaining the urban forest, that the city would be abiding by the same codes as anyone else. So I'm looking to see where those codes are, where it's encoded, so to speak, so that we're following the same standards and playing by the same rules as anyone else. That's the reason for my question. So we might explore that a little bit further. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, just if I may add on that, regarding the authority for the city to maintain the trees, that's found in section 1520.050, which is on page 4 of the ordinance. It specifies that the Director of Parks and Recreation has the authority to maintain the trees. It does not specify a particular standard for that maintenance. As Ms. Zachary outlined before, the basically good protocol and professionalism of staff have led to how the trees are maintained, and they rely on the ANSI standards to help guide them.
Thank you very much. Nothing more from me right now.
I'm anxious to get to public comment, but I did have one question that was just too important. Can you tell us a little bit about how we can promulgate these standards so that more people know about them? I mean, when people come in for permits, are we giving them a copy? You know, if they're coming in for permits for related things, are we giving them, you know, a copy? I mean, how are we going to really reach out to people who prune and the public at large, because it's not always obviously certified arborists that do this work, and so that's, in a sense, we're dealing with the wild, wild west. So how are we going to get out to all those folks?
Chair Williams, you know, we currently have materials that we provide to people regarding maintenance of private trees. We are proposing that as part of our effort to inform the public both of the existing city rules, which is kind of first and foremost, because oftentimes people frankly just don't know, and we find that in lots of areas of city rules and governance. People don't really know what they're supposed to do. So through our website is one way to do that. Through the permitting process is another way to do that. Printed materials that we have on hand in our office, opportunities that we have to distribute the information. I think we believe that having the annual training program will also help. But we do understand that we need private landowners or anybody that wants to do work on a tree, whether they own the property that they live on. We need to take the extra effort to inform them, and we chip at it, away at it in a bunch of different ways, and get the word out through the various city mechanisms that we have.
Can we substantiate that in any deeper manner? I mean, you know, can we just even take a cursory look through the phone book and go, okay, we're going to mail one out to everybody who advertises themselves as doing this kind of work, or something like that?
Chair Williams, certainly bulk mailing is a tactic that we have used to send out information. We can look at what that would be and what it would cost. You know, we often rely on the city water bill as a way to inform people, and we have, you know, the city administrator's newsletter. I think sometimes we find that by putting information out to our contacts via email and notices that there's new postings on the website or newsletters, because of the use of the internet, it's quite amazing how much information can get disseminated that way. Not to say that it'll get to everyone. I'm very well aware of that. We
Might I
do-
suggest the headline being "How to Avoid a $5,000 Fine"? Just so that we, I think it's a challenge to get this out there. I think so many people are going to plead ignorance the first time they get one of these fines, and I think the best that we can do to make sure that everybody should have known, the better. So I know that you can't have all the details of that worked out yet, but I just want to encourage you. Let's take public comment. Sorry that took a little while. We have Diane Channing, followed by Carol Bornstein.
Good afternoon, Chair Williams and Ordinance Committee members. While I applaud the efforts to keep trees from being abused or removed illegally, I feel there's one component that needs to be put into this ordinance. We need to inform homeowners of their responsibility to plant the right tree in the right place, so that when a tree reaches its maximum height, the impacts of solar accessibility do not restrict their neighbors. And that this is when they reach their full maturity, they need to know what that tree is going to be doing. The city needs a comprehensive policy on solar access that educates homeowners and ties together this ordinance, the view ordinance, and the soon-to-be revised hedge ordinance. And I look forward to a broader discussion on our solar energy policies so that we can change our dependence on energy to solar and still maintain a beautiful urban forest. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol, followed by Kellum DeForest.
Chair Williams and committee members, as the chair of the Street Tree Advisory Committee, I wish to convey the committee's goal with respect to 1520 and 1524. In our deliberations, we sought to strengthen these ordinances as a means to better preserve and enhance the City of Santa Barbara's urban forest. And as you saw in this presentation by city staff earlier this afternoon, I'm here to let you know that it accurately reflects the decisions that were made by our committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Kellum DeForest, followed by Wes Brown.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Nancy Rapp, Jill Zachary, and all the Parks and Recreation staff and the city legal staff for moving forward to protect the city's urban forest with a revised series of ordinance. Some of the questions I had have maybe my email got distributed. But point number one was the preservation of trees and landscapes that are part of or adjacent to landmark buildings and structures of merit. Obviously, protecting 10 trees is not sufficient, and there should be some kind of cross-reference in the tree ordinance, in these ordinances, that would refer people that own the historic buildings or structures of merit that they need to go to another section to find out the regulations. That section is 2222, the landmarks, and also as that obviously the landmark designation language needs to be spruced up or to protect the plants, the landscape and the trees and all the plants around a historic landmark. On the penalties for violation, they're not in these ordinances. How is that going to be handled? And why can't they be included in the tree protection ordinance instead of being hidden away in other titles in the code, since they deal specifically with trees? That needs to come along with the with your approval of these ordinances. On the pruning standards, this is advanced from when this when the American National Standards, pruning standards were first discussed, I would ask this committee to suggest or ask that the standards be mandatory rather than just advisory, especially for the city. Thank you.
My fellow Berkeley alumni, Wesley Brown, followed by Kathy Ann Brown.
Is that trying to get me in trouble, Dawes?
No, I'm just trying to make us be school chums.
That's fine. Thank you, members of the council and members of staff, for the consideration you have given to this process. It's a complex process, some complex problems, and I want to say something, first of all, that will make it more complex. But I want to finish by suggesting something that will make it a lot less complex. The complexity has to do with what was referred to as we're trying to do what we can in terms of the realm of practicality. I think that is code word for what the city can afford and what the staff is able to do given its resources. When you're dealing with the issue of trees, I want to remind you that the realm of practicality does not extend for 1 or 2 budgetary years. The impact of trees and tree care extends for 50, 60, 100 years. If you think about the glorious stone pines on Anapamu, that didn't happen, in a short period of time, and that is one of the jewels of the city. So it is that I urge you to consider in making your decisions about ordinances to protect the trees, that decisions made on the basis of a short-term budgetary, hopefully short-term budgetary consideration and what we can, quote, afford to do, has long-term impact on what the benefits of the urban forest provide to the community, to the environment, to the climate, to soils, to oceans. Even as our national government this week looks at the implications of a new energy policy and the environment, you're involved in that here, in the kinds of decisions that you're making relative to the city ordinance. That's the making of difficult part of it. The second thing, Councilman House, your question about where in the current ordinance does the standard reside for city work. And the response that I hear is it resides essentially in the character of who happens to be the arborist at that time. We're fortunate to have someone of excellent character and training in that position. In my estimation, that has not always been the case, nor ought the city's policies depend upon the character of who happens to be in the office at the time. We see the difficulty of that, ramified in our current economic situation nationally. So I would urge you to invest somewhere in the code that is adopted, a standard that would apply to whomever is hired for this job. My sense is it would make it easier for whomever is in that position to defend the decisions that they make. I'm enforcing the city ordinance and code in the decisions that I make. And it would not be dependent upon the particular judgment of whoever happens to be in office at that time. Finally, and this is where it gets simpler, I hope, received this morning a copy of an article that will be printed in the June-July Society of Municipal Arborists magazine, the professional journal that our arborist gets, I presume, each month. It outlines how the ANSI standards, the best management practices, have come to be since the 1970s, and it finishes with these 2 sentences. The suggested language to incorporate A300 into specifications and contracts is, quote, work shall be performed in compliance with A300 standards and to the following specifications, unquote. The suggested language to incorporate A300 into ordinance is, quote, work shall be performed in compliance with A300 standards following specifications written to accomplish the pruning objectives. I commend to the Ordinance Committee this language, and I'll be happy to give you an advance copy of the article, which will be out in June, July. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Kathy Ann Brown, followed by Tony Fisher, who's going to talk about schedules with us.
Good afternoon. I wasn't sure whether I was going to come to the microphone at all because I know you know that I've already said a lot about the ANSI standards and the BMPs, and that I do recommend their use for the pruning of all trees in the urban forest of Santa Barbara. I'd like to just quickly touch on several things that have been said today. One is that we do not require a permit for pruning under 1524, but we do require a permit to remove more than a third or to remove a significant amount of the tree. I've heard this said again and again, and I'm assuming it's referring to 1524-030, which is entitled Lawful Removal of Trees Without Application. That has to do with removal. I don't see in the ordinance anywhere lawful pruning of trees with application. We have application to remove trees. At the last amendment go-round for this, for 1524, Dave Gress and I sat down and worked at a section, which is section 030, so that there would be a section that referred to emergencies. There had been recently a terrible windstorm just before this we realized this became necessary. So we wrote in that without application to or permission, trees that presented a present danger to healthy trees in the immediate vicinity could be someone could file a certificate attesting the condition with the Parks Director. That needed to be a member of the American Society of Consulting Arborists or a member of the City Parks Department. And that trees so weakened by age, disease, storm, fire, or any injury as to cause imminent danger to persons or property could be removed. The director, at least 48 hours, notice needed to be given to the Parks Director at least 48 hours prior to. This section we hoped would allow pruning of dangerous branches that were hanging, maybe broken and were dangerous, or the removal of trees without application. So there didn't need to be any hazard any longer than necessary. I'm not aware of any application or requirement for pruning more than is prohibited. That doesn't mean that it might not be a good idea, but I do not find it in existence here. Secondly, my husband referred to Ms. Zachary's comment about improving enforcement in benefiting the urban forest, but with respect to practicality. And I wanted to quote Gordon Mann again. Gordon Mann is the representative of Society of Municipal Arborists on the ANSI Standards Writing Committee. And he said to me several times, the ANSI standards are not about the trees. The issue is not about the trees. It's about the people, what the trees do for the people. We're not choosing between people and trees. We're not choosing for trees here and making it difficult for people. What we're choosing is benefits for people that can accrue from the best care of trees and that do not accrue without that care. If we deny the trees that care, we deny the people, the community, those benefits. There's a cost. There's a cost. There was mention today on the addition of the necessity or the requirement for a permit by those who work on private properties, who work on city trees, who want to, say, have more pruning of the street tree in front of their house, for example. That is a good move. But I don't want you to think that it's a significant addition of city trees pruned to ANSI standards. Last calendar year, there were 11 trees pruned by permit, that is by private properties, city trees pruned by private properties. among the 2,000 trees, city trees, that were pruned. So doesn't add a lot to city trees that are pruned by ANSI standards, though I'm grateful for those 11 trees to be included under ANSI standards. I hope I make myself clear. Okay. I'm a bit concerned about this formalization of the Street Tree Advisory Committee process in the permitting process. I see from today's staff memo that they say that in addition to changes proposed in the enforcement of private setback and parking trees, parking lot trees, the proposed amendments to the chapters 1520, 1524 presented to City Council on December 9th include the following. 1, formalization of the role of the Street Tree Advisory Committee in permitting, and 2, requiring compliance with the ANSI A300 pruning standards and BMPs as a requirement for permitted work on city trees. Second is true, but it's not very significant, as I said, 11 out of 2,000 trees. I went back and I looked at the memo, the staff memo for your meeting on December 9th, and I do not find any notice or any recommendation that the role of the Street Tree Advisory Committee be formalized. I haven't seen anything publicly about this, and although I think I understand from what was said today, there is wording coming to you. I'm not aware of any movement to formalize it, and I'm interested in what we're formalizing now that we haven't needed to formalize for the number of years. The Street Tree Advisory Committee has been part of the permitting process. I'm just curious, and I would like to ask you for more time to look into this, especially since, as far as I can see, it was not spoken of on December 9th, although it is said in today's memo that it was spoken of. One last thing, and that is that staff says that we use the ANSI standard as a guideline. ANSI sometimes calls itself a guideline because it is not a hard and fast rule. It allows for the fact that every tree is unique and that every growing system, every growing site is unique. It allows for flexibility rather than giving us hard and fast rules. It gives us guidelines. It says in the ANSI standards, do not use the ANSI standards as a standard. And that's what the city is doing when it says it uses it as a guideline. As far as I can see, it is designed to be used as a guideline for writing specifications. There are shoulds and shalls in these guidelines. You cannot enforce a should. It's not written to be enforced. What becomes enforceable is when those shoulds become shalls. And that happens when a specification is written. A specification is a job description, a specific description of a specific job. It's at that point that you decide whether 25% is removal, for example, is sufficient to achieve your pruning objective. If it is not, there's flexibility. What you write in instead is the pruning of this tree shall be 30%, 14%. Wherever it is, but you specify it in the specifications. Then it becomes a shall, then it becomes enforceable. If there are no specifications written, the shoulds are not enforceable. You need to adopt the ordinance for both city and private trees. The standard needs to be the same, and it is for the protection of the trees so that people can benefit to the greatest degree possible. It's probably the least expensive way of getting the benefits. Thank you.
Ms. Brown? Mr. House
I
has
just have a question for you, because that was illuminating what you just said, and I wanted to be sure I truly understood it.
Thank you.
When I read the handed out version of the ANSI 300 standards,
Yes.
and it starts out with saying, don't use this as a standard, I was kind of shook me up a little bit. I mean, the idea is that it's guidelines, but what you gave me was something that was helpful, and that is that what becomes of value is the forethought that might go into an effort to do pruning or to work with the trees.
Yes.
And that shows up in the form of specifications. You set your objectives, your specifications, and you have something to hold on to later if you were, say, accused of not doing the right thing. You've followed through on what you planned on doing. And so, in my understanding then of what you're saying is you're recommending some form of a process for the private sector, not just private sector doing work on public land, which already has that well established, but for private entities doing work on private land, that they would indicate to someone, I suppose our committee or to our staff, or to submit something that says, this is what I intend to do?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, I do, and the reason I do is because you have a before picture of the tree or trees that are being pruned. You don't have to wonder what it looked like before it was pruned, and because you need to put that foresight and the thinking ahead into what you're going to do so that violations do not happen. We're recommending that the city enforce its business license requirement. There is a business license requirement now. It's not enforced strongly enough so that many people who are working on trees do not have business licenses. Business license would also give us a way to identify who is pruning trees so that we can help with education. We can let them know when workshops are coming up. We can make sure that they get the ANSI documents and the BMP as soon as they sign up for their business license. It's a way of our tracking who's pruning trees in the city and helping them. And then we would suggest that a permit process be set up, that specifications be done before the job is done, just like we do for the bathroom remodel that my husband and I are involved in. We needed to come in to Building and Zoning, and we needed to show them what our job specification was, what our specs were for the bathroom, what it was going to involve. We needed to pay for a permit. We needed to pay over $200 from our permit. We're suggesting that we experiment to see if we can get a free permit for specifications that comply with ANSI standards, according to the wording that my husband just showed you from the article.
Good, thank you very much. And one last thing. In your exploration, did you find any way that you've heard of to do that without it being a tremendous burden on a fairly marginally funded staff to be able to accomplish what you're talking about?
Well, there's several suggestions. Redwood City has been using this sort of plan for many years. One thing that they suggested was companies that have proved themselves to be reputable could be issued a revocable 1-year license to prune. They would not need to bring in their specifications for every job. It would be revocable so that if they fell off the wagon, they could be stopped right away. If they started doing things that are not in accordance with ANSI standards, their permit would be pulled right away.
That would be one strategy to manage
That's
the workload.
one way. Another way is to use volunteers. Volunteers can go around beforehand and take pictures of trees ahead of time. There are people, not just me, there are lots of people who are interested in our urban forests.
Great.
They could be trained.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Fisher.
Good afternoon, members of the Ordinance Committee. Just to alert you, since you brought up the subject of scheduling, I think an agreement has been reached regarding that, and you can hold your breath and wait for it at 2 o'clock. Regarding, there's a whole list of things. My notes got longer as I listened to the meeting, and I was particularly impressed by the prior comments about the difficulty of dealing with the ANSI standards, whether they are guidelines or legally mandatory. And I have not looked at that, but I'm assuming that's something that does need careful looking at. And some of my other comments will maybe highlight why, if you're using those standards, if they aren't really written with any enforceable specificity, all of this becomes meaningless, because you will have large disputes as to what was allowed or not allowed, and I'm leaving that to you to deal with. But I want to go back. Many years ago, I was involved with drafting of the Historic Structures Ordinance. We intentionally worded that ordinance the way it is worded, so that an historic landmark could be a tree, could be a building, could be a site. Just because a tree is a landmark doesn't mean everything around it is. Just because a site is a landmark doesn't mean everything on it is. Just because a building is a landmark doesn't mean that the landscaping around it is. As we know, old buildings have new landscaping, has been done over the years. And that new landscaping may or may not be historic, may not be tied all to the period of the building. And therefore, as if you saw the article in the Sunday paper regarding the landmark gardens in Montecito, it pointed out that very few gardens in the United States have historic landmark designations. For that very reason is that people have different, over the years, a building built 100 years ago, it's had a lot of owners, and very few times is that historic garden preserved. Your courthouse has an historic landscaping. Santa Barbara High School, the landmark designation goes 5 feet from the building. Doesn't go beyond that. I think that's intentional. Probably true also of the kiosk. But the temporary buildings obviously were not labeled as historic for the very reason nobody wanted to preserve them. So I think when you look at these things, you have to look at it in that context, and that we don't want to prevent taking down something that's not consistent with the adjacent historic structure. That actually interferes with preserving or restoring the context, which a property owner may or may not want to do. The concept of appeals, 15.20.160. I'm guessing that that refers only to a private person applying for a permit, but doesn't apply to the director deciding to cut down some public trees. If it does, it isn't clear. And then there's a question of how does the public get notice as to exactly what's going to be pruned or cut, and what level of pruning is going to take place so that you can decide whether to appeal. As a member of the public, if I'm assured that the ANSI standards are going to be followed by regulation, and that somebody out there with a chainsaw is not going to be encouraged by the adjacent property owner to take just one more branch, which is what can happen when the Parks Department crew is out there, or the Edison crew, and I see no reference to Edison in all this, and they do a lot of trimming. But the Parks Department crew is out there, and a neighbor says, could you take that extra branch out? And well, maybe they shouldn't, but maybe they will because they want to be nice to the neighbor. I think you have to look at that. The penalties and the administrative citation process. That's a very secret operation. Nobody goes to those meetings because they're not hearings, because they're not public. They're not noticed. They take place in a conference room somewhere. Nobody knows they're happening. Nobody sees the results. The information is very secret. Unlike going over to the courthouse and paying a parking ticket, there's a record, or if you challenge it, there's a trial, it's public. That doesn't happen in this administrative process. So what standards are being applied and what actually happens, you should maybe find out before you implement it or expand it, as to what really goes on, how many dollars are collected, how many dollars in fines are imposed, how does that process really work? The public trees, private property trees, the standard. I do think that you have to have the standard for the city forest, owned forest, has to be as concrete as it is for private property trees. Because, and I think the prior speakers brought out the fact that things do change based on personnel, and, face it, the guy handling the chainsaw can make a very, very permanent decision about what that tree is going to look like. And he should have some pretty clear standards. Otherwise, he can just say, well, I decided it was consistent with ANSI, and therefore I did it. Just as a matter of definition, this is almost like, let's reduce it to the absurd, but that's what's going to happen. 15.24.020 says that a tree is in the front yard if 50% of the trunk is in the front yard. Well, if the tree leans away from the front yard, is it outside the front yard? If it leans into the front yard, is it in the front yard? Is this measured at the ground? Is this measured 4 feet above the ground? Trees which are planted are sometimes planted outside the front yard but grow into the front yard. So anyhow, that's a definition there under paragraph B that I'm going to leave to Scott Vincent to try and figure out someday how to enforce it. I don't think the decision about how to protect your urban forests, publicly owned trees, should be tied to what funding is available today. I mean, this is a bad year to be making those decisions, and you're blocking in the future of the city based on an economic situation, and that really should focus an awful lot of finance committee and budget discussions as to how to do that. So in summary, I think you need to look at how the appeal process works, whether it works for public trees or only works for private trees, and how that enforcement system functions to see if it's really going to be effective, and does the public know even about it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, there was a host of questions that were brought up, and I'm going to ask very briefly to answer any of the ones that you especially feel are relevant to the discussion. I think that we are going to need to wrap this up quickly, so please be brief if you want to respond to any of the questions or comments made.
Chair Williams and members of the Ordinance Committee, I think that both the speakers and staff have talked about the fact that the ANSI standards are a guideline, and the recommendations from the Street Tree Advisory Committee to require a private entity pruning a public tree follow those guidelines is something that we all concur is appropriate for the ordinance. There are occasions when, as an example, a tree can be pruned more than a quarter, and nothing in the ordinance limits that right now. So part of the approach is, from the work that we've done at your direction, is to try to tackle those egregious violations and broaden community understanding and commitment to following city standards, both from a neighborhood level perspective when a tree is pruned inappropriately and from the urban forest perspective. So in any one case, as a guideline, a decision for each tree might be different, whether it's done within the city based on our pruning approach and our professional determination of what's needed given the circumstances that we face, and similarly for a private landowner. Proposal to do something given their circumstances and what they're facing. I think that's the goal with both the ordinance amendments and incorporating the ANSI standards. So overall, the pruning practices throughout the city are improved.
So maybe the two that I thought were most conspicuous was, why not specifically reference ANSI standards for the city's own authority, especially since it is a guideline? Is there some pitfall to specifically referencing the ANSI standards? And then the second piece is this idea of some sort of prior or prescriptive permit as for some of this work. Is that do we have the capability of doing something like that?
Chair Williams and members of the Ordinance Committee, first of all, and I would ask Mr. Downey or Mr. Vincent to jump in, it's my understanding that Redwood City has dedicated staff that issue permits for the pruning of private trees on private property, regardless of what the purpose of the pruning is. And we currently do not have that kind of resource to do that. And so we would have to look very carefully at what it would take to have that requirement and to review the standards, inspect the tree prior to pruning and inspect the tree after the pruning. Similarly, if the requirement were that we were to write contract specifications for every tree that city staff pruned, we would need to go away and look at what that would take to do, given our current budget and our current requirement for pruning on an annual basis. So I can't answer that question today, except that we'd have to go back and look at what it would take from a staff resource base to make that happen.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to repeat Mr. Williams's question, is there any reason not to incorporate something in this stating that it is the policy of the City of Santa Barbara to adhere to the ANSI 300 standards?
We're debating who's the best person to try to answer your question. When we addressed the ANSI standards at the direction of council, our main concern at that time was enforceability.
I'm sorry?
When we looked at ANSI standards with council direction, we did it from the standpoint that the request was that it be used as an enforcement tool. In looking at the ANSI standards as a guideline, can be stated, one imagines it could be stated in the code that the city adheres to ANSI standards when it prunes trees. If we established a requirement that the city has to write a contract specification for every tree that it prunes, that would be entirely different. We've tied the ANSI standard requirement, or at least the Street Tree Advisory Committee has recommended that we tie the ANSI standard to an enforcement mechanism by virtue of issuing a permit. As Ms. Brown said, it is a guideline unless it's tied directly to a permit approval or some sort of very specific action. We assume, based on the industry within Santa Barbara, that understanding and knowledge of ANSI standards overall will lead to better practices. How we demonstrate that over time is something that we would have to monitor. Again, it goes back to the goal is to address illegal pruning and significant violations, which is what we're really faced with when we're looking at the issue that council asked us to consider, is how do we do a better job avoiding these situations in the first place? Sure. Not how do we do a better job monitoring the pruning of all trees within the urban forest? With that understanding, that is our goal anyway, because clearly we want to protect and enhance the urban forest.
I think what we may be getting at is something just a little bit more innocuous than creating a scope of work for each tree, which is just in 15.20.050, Director Authority and Responsibility, just saying, the director shall have the authority to remove or replace any tree or other planted improvements and use the ANSI standards for their guidelines in doing so, or something like that.
Basically, what I'm looking for and what I'm wondering why there would be a problem with it is just a clear statement that the City of Santa Barbara itself uses the ANSI 300 standard as a guideline for its own pruning practices. And I don't know where the best place to make that statement is. I don't see why that would be a problem. Is there a problem?
I think rather than in the ordinance, the better place for that language is in the Urban Forest Master Plan or Street Tree Master Plan. We do plan to update that plan in the near future and have begun work in updating that. I think really that's a better place for that language rather than in the ordinance.
Okay. Another question I had, one of the speakers raised the issue of an emergency tree pruning or tree removal. Is that covered anywhere?
Mr. Chair. That is, the case of an emergency is covered in 1524.035, which are pruning activities without application. In those cases, the property owner presents an arborist report to the city arborist explaining the need for the emergency activity, and then the arborist confirms that the work is going to be conducted according to sound arboricultural practices. And so that is a way of addressing those emergency situations where the tree, because of a number of different circumstances, presents a hazard to the public. A similar process is available for the removal of trees when they also present a danger.
Okay. And Mr. Vincent, my final question is also to you, and that is the question of, for instance, Edison doing their pruning. Do we have any control whatsoever over how they do pruning?
Edison is obligated by the Public Utility Commission's rules to clear, to maintain a clear space from their lines. How they do that, it does not specify how they do it, and I think that at this point I need to discuss it with Mr. Downey a little bit further about how we address Edison. Historically, they have not received permits for their work, and I could see where requiring them to obtain permits for all of their work could be extremely administratively taxing, just given the amount of work that they do or their contractors do within the city. So the best answer to that particular circumstance needs a little bit more review. If I can take 2 minutes to respond to Mr. Fisher's questions so that the committee understands.
Please, Mr. Vincent.
The ANSI standards, as members of the public and staff have explained, are generally written as guidelines. They are not specific prescriptions or requirements. In order to make them into a penal standard or a requirement, it requires a permitting process. That's where you move from the should to the shall. When you would create the objective and create the specifications, those shoulds become shalls, and then you follow through. And as staff has explained, a prospective permitting process at this time and for our staff resources is probably prohibitive. The enforcement or the appeals process concerns the permit requirements. It does not. The appeals that are specified in chapters 1520 and 1524 are not involved with the enforcement process. The enforcement process is not a secret process. It may not be the most public process in the same way that a city council meeting has Brown Act noticing, but the enforcement process is not secret. It follows the administrative citation procedures that are specified in Chapter 1.25 of the Municipal Code and by council resolution. There is a written record, and there is an appeal process all the way to the Superior Court where the written appeal is presented to the court. So it's not a secret process, and then ultimately it ends up in the same court that Mr. Fisher was giving as an example of a public process. And finally, the 50% rule is modeled after a civil code section that identifies the ownership of trees, and it's measured from the ground. The courts look at the ownership of the tree as being an extension of the ground. And so if more than 50% of the tree trunk at the ground lies on one side or the other of the front setback, that is the determiner. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. House?
Thank you, Mr.
And we got to
Williams.
wrap this up, committee.
I think that several years ago I served on the Community Advisory Committee for the Air Pollution Control District, and I got a big lesson on best management practices, the whole concept, the whole idea, and because we were dealing there with the oil industry, and it became very, very important for us to speak to that rather large classification of things that one could do without being actually specific in the general policy about what they were. So, for instance, at the beginning, Master Street Tree Plan, we actually speak to the Master Street Tree Plan, which Mr. Downey's talking about there, and it seems to me that somewhere in here we should be speaking to the best management practices. We require it in 1520 of the private entities doing work on public land, and we actually go so far as to specify or suggest two related pieces, which is the ANSI A300 and the companion best management practices published by the International Society of Arboriculture. And so I think that we want to set our sights on utilizing best management practices, and perhaps even if sometimes you'll see where feasible comes in. But at least we establish that that's the approach that we use, and as specified where? In our Master Street Tree Plan, you know, so the detail comes in the more comprehensive view, or comprehensive rendition of what our practices will be, you know, our standards and practices. But we start out with this general idea that we're going to do the best we possibly can using the state-of-the-art best management practices. So I'd like to see somewhere that referred to as a general overarching approach that the city uses as well as encourages, public and private. I think that what I'm hearing so far here is that there's, I don't think it's an either or here. I think there's probably some middle ground that could be very, very helpful. It seems to me that we do have a business license process, companies that are going to be engaged in this kind of activity. There's a point of contact there. Seems like somewhere in that process there would be an opportunity for those same companies to pledge to abide by best management practices as outlined in city's document or plan, or street tree plan or whatever. I'm not sure right where those things are, but at that point, for that commitment to be made, that gives us a relationship we wouldn't have otherwise. It's also a point of contact for education. Where they get to be handed out the information and all the ordinance and the fine structure and all the rest of it. So we have that point of contact. It also seems to me that there would be an opportunity there for the city to work on the other side, where we could provide a list to those who are looking for arborists to do work on their trees in a private sector, who would be on our list of those who have made that commitment. Another positive way to encourage those to participate and to be adopting these best management practices, such as ANSI 300 and the ISA BMPs. So I think that's not here yet, and I would really like it to be there somewhere, showing how we would implement that. So some form of either a certification process like that, associated possibly with a business license, an annual renewal of some sort, so there's a re-upping each year. If there were complaints and issues during that process, those things could be dealt with. There is flexibility already built into these standards, but they do ask for some objective specifications and to be there. So why couldn't we ask that those be kept on hand and availability on request, as opposed to having them be the basis of a permit for each and every activity, so that they would pledge to do that for each of their jobs. They would They would provide the specifications and a report on the results of their work on request. Then that would be defensible for them. They're keeping in consistent with the standards. We're not going into a heavy permit process, but everybody has something to turn to when there's an issue that may arise later. So I think there's something in that. A couple of other things. One, a question was raised was, where is removal with a permit identified in here? There's removal without a permit. I think that was the way the question was phrased. It was 152430 that was identified. So let's just take a quick look at that and just see. It seemed like there was one bookend was there, but the other one was missing. So what are we missing?
It's in there.
Is it in there? Was that just called out? 040? Okay, so we have both sides of the equation. We have both of the pieces there. Okay, good. In something that was submitted to us, let's see if I can find it real quick here. Here, there was a suggestion that pruning would be performed to specifications in compliance with A300 standards, except pollarding and espalier pruning. That's pretty detailed stuff. So what in the world is that? And is that something that we need to call out here? Or is it something we forgot to mention, or what? Yes, sir.
Commissioner House, the espalier and pollarding we feel are covered under the portion that's significant alteration of the natural character. Those two pruning practices take a natural-looking tree and provide a specific shape to them that is different than the natural character. So we feel that would be covered under the alteration of the natural character.
Got it. Making a tree look like a giraffe or something. Okay, got it. Okay, and then I have a question for staff regarding with our practices inside the city and the way that we do stuff. When you send a crew out to do work on trees on a given street, isn't there a work order or something associated with that actually tells them what to do? I mean, gives them some guidance and guidelines? Doesn't that fulfill, I mean, to some degree, isn't that what we're talking about when we say specifications?
Commissioner House, the crew on a general day-to-day basis goes to, say, the 800 block of Arriaga Street, and the street supervisor instructs them, we're going out there to do X, Y, Z to those trees. It's a verbal communication at this point in most cases, and it's not necessarily a work order, but just an assignment.
You know, just on a management perspective, it would seem that given how sensitive our tree city is, you know, that there's an opportunity right there to just get a little more rigorous with that on a management basis, that your supervisor, maybe you even have a standard for these kinds of trees, or this particular, you know, becomes a file over time. This is how we deal with this. These are the specifications for this this block or something. But it just seems like that seems to be the real touchstone key part of this ANSI 300 thing, is you take a moment and you consider what you're going to do, you write it down thoughtfully, and then you have something to look back on when you know, to reflect on at the end of the day and say, did we do what we set out to do? And that is the thing that's being asked for by the public, and that I think is really the heart of the ANSI 300 approach. Am I mistaken in that?
I think that's an accurate assessment.
Well, I would really encourage, out of our discussion today, that you consider something like that, perhaps not to micromanage or anything, but when we're looking at the way that we would like the private sector to deal with our trees on public land, and that we're recommending and encouraging them to do this when they're doing their work outside of our purview on their own private land, that we would adopt that as well. And if that were a consistent approach that we use to our urban forest, I think that would go a long way to addressing the exact concerns that had council want to have us work on this in the first place. So I wish that we could, I think maybe a little like what Mr. Francisco was saying, there could be a kind of almost a preamble or an overarching statement that says this is what we're advocating, is for this thoughtful consideration, identifying of this, quote, specifications, objectives and specifications on projects. And there may be ways to really reduce the workload associated with that So my suggestions then, I'm not suggesting a permit program, but I am suggesting some form of certification possibly associated with business license, some kind of a pledge that can be reviewed or that needs to be re-upped on a annual or some biannual basis or something, and a list that might be associated for the city to for the public to access for those companies that have stepped up, and that there should be some kind of a overarching statement that we in the city use best management practices when we deal with our urban forest. Now, I don't know that we can accomplish all that today, but I just want to put that out there as where I would like to see this thing go, and I think it's gone a long way, but it's missing something yet for me to prove it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a certification process is beyond what we can accomplish in 10 minutes, but it may be, I just think that we ought to think a little bit more about what that would mean. I mean, that would definitely be putting a lot of people out of business in this town. And we think about, well, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? But that would definitely be the case. I mean, there is a lot of people. This is the pruning business, from my perspective, is a wild, wild west. And I'm not sure that that's a good thing, but that's the current reality of it. There's a lot of people who do it that are certified arborists, and there's a lot of people who do it that are not. And
I thought we already have a requirement that that people doing work of this kind have a business license.
We do have a requirement of a business license,
Mr. Chair. The city's business license requirement is a fee generation. It's not a regulatory device. The business license chapter specifically says so. So this would require an entirely new licensing process and qualifications, and we can look at what that would entail. Regarding the chair's comments concerning certified arborists, absolutely, there are plenty of people who do work on trees within the city that are not certified arborists. One other point that I would make for the committee to consider is that many private owners do their own work. And if we were going to get into a process that required some kind of certification simply to do work on trees, that you could be precluding individuals from doing their own work if they wanted to. So that would be something we would need to deal with as staff in making a recommendation regarding this.
Mr. Chair, we do. I mean, green building. We have contractors who step up and actually say we're going to follow certain practices. And I was prepared here today to come and hear a staff report that included a recommendation that the city would do something similar to what I was just saying. That it would actually bring forward the idea that if there were businesses in town who did tree pruning and dealt with the urban forest, that if they were to voluntarily or in some other way abide by the best management practices that we've been talking about, that the city would be prepared to actually publicize that or have that available as a list for the public. Now, I didn't hear that in any of the staff presentation, and I'm disappointed not hearing that. Is there any part of this that indicates that we'd be moving to holding a high standard for work on the urban forest that would be a step in that direction, or was I just, misinformed as I came here today?
Mr. Chair and Council Member House, in our assessment of the need to educate tree companies and landscape, we did address that. And when we had a public workshop, we posed it as a certification program, and that wasn't very well received. However, the idea of the city sponsoring a training and creating a list of companies or individuals, in some cases, that went through the training was something that was supported and something that we would commit to do. How we posted that list and how often it was updated, those are details that we would need to work out. But we do understand that we need to help people find the right place to go to have their tree pruned. And so I would say from the staff perspective, there is a commitment to do that as part of this program.
And I just want to say that I'm willing to go as far as encouraging better knowledge and better training on the part of everyone. But I just, you know, I know I'm supposed to be the big government guy, but the idea that of us requiring everybody who wants to prune their tree in their, you know, yard to go through a certification process seems to me like a little much, and I can't get there. You know, I do think that there are more things that we can do, but this is a huge step in the right direction, and I just don't feel like we should mar significant progress towards protecting our urban forest with talking only about what we cannot and do not have the feasibility to do right now, because you know, is a limited capability that our staff has in terms of enforcement, and I think prescriptive enforcement is not in the realm of possibility right now. And I agree with the statement that we shouldn't always make decisions based on current budget climate, but I'm not sure that it is even within the realm of possibility in the near future. And I just think that while prescriptive might be the way to go eventually, I just don't think we can do that today. So I'm going to suggest, and I'm going to move that we move forward the municipal code chapters, changes to municipal code chapters 15.20 and 15.24, with the addition of asking the assistant city attorney to prepare language for when this goes to council, specifically referencing the ANSI standards for the city's own practices. I mean, my suggestion would be putting it in 15.20.050 or 15.20.030, but I think that what I heard is that we all want that to be in there.
I'll second that.
Mr. Chair, just to speak to your motion, the thing that I'm looking for that is, I think you almost have it there. What I'm missing, and maybe this isn't the right place for what I'm missing, is the need for some sort of standard to be set on a citywide basis that we say that in maintaining the urban forest, we the community, the royal we use best management practices in doing that. Now, obviously, there'll be exceptions, there'll be emergencies, but also the best management practices that we've been referencing have tremendous flexibility in them, so you're appropriate to each given situation. So it's not like one of these ultimatum kind of things. No, it sets the tone and the direction. And that's the piece that's missing for me in this. And if we could get that in place, and then given the pledge that you're talking about, Ms. Zachary, about education, when we have a point of contact, and you know how the Green Gardener program works and all that kind of thing, that kind of stuff, that would be great. But I think we need somewhere to sort of overarching a statement that where we're going in each of these different ways, the way the city does business on its own property, in its own work, the way the private sector does work on public, and the way that we really encourage the private sector, private folks to do, that we are encouraging and moving in the direction of these best management practices. That's what I'm looking for in the final draft, for me to be supportive when it gets to council, at least.
I just don't think that staff or this committee can come up with that now, and I think it's pretty clear that we're moving that direction. This is much more substantive of a move in that direction than our previous code, and so you know, I believe that we are sending that message. Could we do more? Absolutely. Do we have the capability to do more right now or in the next 5 years? I'm not sure that we do. So let's vote.
I'm going to support the motion, but I am definitely going to be watchful for that. And hopefully that when it comes to council, you'll be really addressing those things. I think you can. I think you're already there. It's just a matter of saying it out loud without the fear that it's going to mean you're going to be overburdened in workload or something. So,
and Mr. Downey, don't let any of these folks who have violated this not get away with not getting a business permit, because Mr. Pearson behind you and the rest of the city employees really need that business permit funds for us to be able to keep on doing work in this city. So please. All right, let's call the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?